So what is this? I was on a walk in Durham by the river. I was visiting my brother who's doing maths there at the university, and I thought it was a children's playground. It was missing a slide or some ropes or something. Well, actually it was also missing children. And out of curiosity, I walked a bit closer and noticed that there were some details etched, chiseled into those upstanding logs. And as I got even closer, I noticed that on the left, one of the trees was bigger than all the rest, and you could sit inside it. So that's what I did. And that's when something remarkable happened. All of the trees line up. When you sit in that seat, all the other trees take on a coherence. This is the Last Supper. Those plates and the window and other details are pointing at Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece painting, the Last Supper. And you are sat in the place of Jesus, looking out at your bewildered 12 disciples. Because you have started to talk about your body being eaten. You've just given bread to your disciples and you said, "Take, eat, this is my body which will be broken for you." And then you've followed that up with, "Drink this wine, this is my blood which will be shed for you." Now, the disciples up to that point, they have been following Jesus around and he's been doing remarkable things. But now things have suddenly shifted to something very dark. And of course they don't understand what's going on. Let's just zoom out. Again, all religions from the outside look a little bit odd, look a little bit arbitrary, look a bit random. If I was to visit a country and observe monks going towards a temple, let's say Hindus going to a temple for Ganesh, then I would be able to understand a couple of symbols in there. I might be able to understand broadly what's going on, but it doesn't have an energy for me, it doesn't have a synergy, whereas for the people in that space, in that sacred space, all of the language, the clothes, the rituals, the traditions, the texts, the community, all of it has a synergy and an energy which is deeply meaningful. So if we just go back into the sculpture of the upper room, it's called, by Colin Wilburn, and we go back into that seat, we're now in a place of coherence. So for the disciples, in the end, if we go back to the New Testament story, in the end, the disciples understood what was going on. They got it. That he was predicting his own death. In 3 days later, he would rise again, and so on and so on. And if you are Christian, if you sign up to the Christian creed, if you have a Christology, which thinks that Jesus was doing something sacred, then all of that has an energy. And when you yourself then go to church and are part of all of those rituals, then it also has an energy for you there. So this is a piece of art. It's not a children's playground. But just like all good art, it has many different layers to it. And I think we can look at that scene and think about our own families and our own communities. If you're part of a community and a family, then there are jokes, there are traditions, there are little rituals which that family have, which to an outsider would just seem a little bit odd. And you would feel alien. If you go to a family dinner as an outsider and they start making family jokes, then you can feel a little bit on the side. So, this takes us to the second question. This piece of art is sharply relevant for climate change because there's a difference between people who get it and people who don't get it. If you have understood the climate crisis from a systems perspective, if you've sat in that seat and you understand how it all lines up, then it has a different energy and synergy to it. It has a depth to it, which you don't get if you're on the outside. And I think those trees are quite symbolic of how climate education feels to most students in schools who don't have that systems perspective, who are just looking in from the outside. So they do a bit of climate education in biology, a little bit in physics and chemistry. They might do it in a religion or moral lesson or geography. And those individual trees, let's say, those individual blobs of knowledge just seem a little bit alien. Like, you might even ask yourself the question, why are people so excited about this? Why do people talk about this as if it's some existential crisis? So when I went to that talk in 2012 and the brick landed on my head, I saw for the first time how it all fitted together. I saw for the first time how all the different aspects of sustainability had a coherence, and there were trigger concepts in there. There were threshold concepts that got me from, let's say, the darkness into the light, if we're going to use religious language. And those threshold concepts were things like a closed mass system, planetary boundaries, tipping points. These things, once they're understood, they have a transformative impact on how the rest of your understanding functions. And this is why I wrote this. In some respects, we could understand the episodes which are going to come later in this series and each chapter of the Climate Academy textbook as a tree, but not a tree just randomly in the ground, but a tree which marks out a definitive space. I think climate education to students who don't have this systems perspective, who are not sat in that central tree, can feel a little bit like walking around in an open field. Like, well, where do I go next? What's the shape to this? What am I supposed to do here? It's a featureless landscape where lots of the same things are on repeat. The Climate Academy and this textbook defines that system space. It gives a coherent definition of what the problem is. And once you have that in place, you can then indulge the details. So the Climate Academy, the content itself, of course, is important in terms of marking out these planetary boundaries, in marking out the coherent space for what matters and how it all fits together. But the beauty of doing this program is that it then allows you to indulge your own interests and your own expertise. So once you have that systems perspective, you can go back to look at the physics tree or the geography tree or the psychology tree and ask deeper questions of it without getting lost, without getting disorientated. So the Climate Academy has got this double impact. First of all, it introduces new concepts like tipping points, planetary boundaries, and so on. And those new framing concepts have a revelatory impact on all the other details. And they give the students, and give a reader, the chance to indulge what they particularly like. Indeed, those trees mark a clear space. Those are the planetary boundaries. And this can be seen in the work of Kate Ragworth, who came up with the concept of the donut economy. So the donut economy basically says that there is a safe operating space for humans on the planet, and in the shape of a donut. And you need to respect that donut to have all the safe space in the middle, to have your economy, to have your education, hospitals, well-being, etc. So these planetary boundaries mark this safe operating space. And in that sense, this piece of art communicates that very important fundamental truth to environmental education. You've got to have a respect for the planetary boundaries as a first principle of what you're doing. If we just push this piece of art one final step and zoom in on the psychology of the disciples that were in that upper room, then you have this psychological up and down. So there was confusion, there was disorientation, there was a lot of anxiety in that room when Jesus started saying weird things. But then the revelation came. And that transformative effect of going through some difficult stuff and then seeing how it all fits together, that's quite close to the experience of understanding things from a systems perspective. That you have to be willing to engage with things which are quite difficult at first sight, but then it triggers different energies once you've got it. So once you get it, once you're onto a project, then it's no longer about these simple cliches about being happy or sad about the world. There's a sense of purpose, there's deeper things in play, virtues in play. Now, of course, I'm not saying here that the Climate Academy is any kind of cult. You're free to walk in, walk out, etc. But what I've experienced myself with my different generations of students who've gone through the Climate Academy program is that this same psychological slope is in play. First, there's the disorientation of feeling that you don't understand stuff. And then the really difficult bit where you start to see things from this systems perspective. So suddenly there's a coherence, suddenly there's an energy to it, which at the beginning is quite a dark energy because you realize just how big these forces are. These Earth system forces which are in play dwarf humans. And the human systems that are in play are extremely complex: the economic, the political, the social, the psychological. But if you just hold it in place and you start doing projects, there is an energy that comes with that, a kind of, let's say, mission. And that transcends the usual categories that we might want to think are in play in education, like we just like consume education. Suddenly you become an agent, you have agency, and you see the big picture. And there's that revelatory feeling of sitting and seeing things clearly for the first time and how it all fits together. That gives a certain drive. So the Climate Academy, I think this sculpture, it was just at the back of my memory like this. And when I started to write this textbook, my imagination flipped back to that scene, back to Durham. And suddenly I understood so many different things with clarity about what I was doing. And that's the final thing to say about this image. And that is that you'll see throughout this Climate Academy program that there are, in the textbook, in the student book, and in these videos, important images, cultural symbols. This can be art, it can be music, it can be history. But these things offer ways to see everything from a new perspective. And there's a power in art, there's a power in culture. And if we could just identify those some of these key cultural objects, it opens things up in a new way. It gives new depth to everything. So since I have started writing this, since I started the Climate Academy program, I've been harvesting and hunting for those symbols, and you'll find them scattered out throughout the program. So what does it mean to get it? It's kind of a really puzzling question. And if you have got it, if you do understand the climate crisis and the sustainability crisis fully, then it can be quite difficult to know why other people seem so unresponsive to it. You know, if this is a sixth mass extinction event, why are people not doing stuff? And that's like weird, like what? It's really odd. And I was lucky enough to just by chance have this talk in 2012 where the brick landed on my head and I had this revelatory moment. And since then I've been puzzling about what it is to get it. Why after that talk, when I talk with my colleagues or my friends or my family, why was this gap there? What was it that I had understood that they had not yet understood? And I think in the simplest sense, these trees mark out those planetary boundaries. It does take an emotional openness. It does take a certain amount of courage to look at those limits. Looking at any limit to human life is, of course, always a bit of a challenge. But I think that is this threshold concept. That is this moment of coherence. That's the moment of clarity. Now, films have played with this notion of getting it or not. And here's a classic, absolute classic film, which I use when I teach Plato, when I teach Descartes, when I teach all kinds of, it's sharply relevant, and it's The Matrix.
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be what? Be real?
As a teacher of philosophy, I teach many students every year, altogether about 200. And it's always interesting to me that philosophy is not just a question of intellectual capacity. It requires from the student a certain willingness to be vulnerable, a certain willingness to engage and drop assumptions. And there's this curious relationship between knowledge and, let's say, human personality or character. And the climate crisis brings all of those issues very sharply to the surface. There are some very scientifically literate people who don't get it. There are even sometimes people that work inside climate itself that don't somehow, when you talk, they don't have clarity about the big picture. They're lost in the details somehow. Of course, there are other people who just don't want anything to do with it and dismiss it all as a hoax or a fake, or keep it at arm's length in other ways. So there's this curious puzzle with the climate crisis about why, given that this is a sixth mass extinction event, why do we not respond more fully as a society? Why is it so difficult? Why is there so much inertia about it? And it's a deep dive moment. We're going to go back in history and we're going to look at a case study to illustrate what some of the issues in play might be through the case of Galileo, Copernicus, and the solar system. Let's ask ourselves the question, whose side would we have been on during the trial of Galileo in 1633? Here he is pictured in front of the Inquisition. There are instruments of torture on the table because Galileo has been a very naughty boy. Galileo has put forward an observation and a body of work which confirms that the sun is in the center of the solar system and not the Earth. So whose side would we have been on? Most of us would like to think that we would have been on the side of Galileo, on the side of science, on the side of truth. But I think the truth is a little bit more awkward than that. Because if you think about it, this theory put forward by Galileo, the heliocentric universe model, what that means is that planet Earth is spinning through outer space at over 100,000 kilometers an hour. Now, as I'm sat here and I look out the window, I don't feel that I'm moving. I don't feel the wind in my hair as if I'm traveling at 100,000 kilometers an hour. On top of that, there's also a spin of the Earth on its axis of over 1,000 kilometers an hour around the equator. So you've got two crazy speeds, two crazy spins, and yet my sense of myself is that I'm not moving and the sun is moving over my head every day from east to west. So common sense was on the side of the Inquisition. Common sense, like the senses, all the senses seem to suggest that Galileo was wrong. And on top of that, you have also a belief which has been taken from Aristotle, so going back to the ancient Greeks, that the Earth is at the center of the universe in a moral sense. So on the fringes of the universe, things don't change. And in the center of the universe, you have change, you have decay, you have potentials. Whereas where God lives, and God and the angels and so on, they live in a place where it's perfect. So things are not changing out there. So Galileo was proposing that those celestial objects were moving and therefore subject to change. So that offended the people in 1633. It offended the moral fabric of their universe. And in a sharper sense, it was also very offensive what Galileo was saying, because God had made the universe, and God had made the planet and humans, and God had visited this planet as Jesus, and he died, and all of this drama was being played out on the central stage, on planet Earth. It seemed very peculiar to the minds of people in 1633 that God would have created a universe in which the Earth was just some random rock, a few places displaced from the sun, inside a whole cosmic order where that is not the center of gravity, where that's not the center of attention. It'd be a bit like going to a theatre and expecting to see a play, let's say a biblical play on the stage, and you're told after a certain amount of time that actually the play's happening in the female toilet on the 3rd floor. Like, why would you put the play on there? So, common sense, this metaphysical view of the universe, and the biblical stories confirmed to people that Galileo was wrong. So I think most people would have been on the side of the Inquisition and their instruments of torture. So what's going on here in the Galilean controversy is science is offending all kinds of power structures, all kinds of systems of authority. And it's interesting to reflect that the science wasn't new. So the court case happens in 1633. Galileo was told to recant, told to take it back. And what Galileo has confirmed in his observations is actually theory that's quite old by now. Copernicus, 90 years before, in 1543, had put forward this model. But there hadn't been the observational evidence of Galileo, who just invented a telescope, which created a telescope. Well, it was actually the Dutchman before him, but anyway, it's a new telescope. These observations have confirmed this abstract model. And in between these two events, the abstract model by Copernicus and the trial by Galileo, there's an interesting case of Bruno, Giordano Bruno. And he is tortured in 1600 for agreeing with Copernicus. And this torture is just the warm-up act to him being burnt upside down on a stake. So these power interests are very real. Galileo in the end is just put under house arrest for being a naughty boy. But this conflict, this very sharp conflict between science and politics, science and the economy, if you like, science and psychology, it's visceral. And it takes humans a long time to get over it. It takes humans a long time to accommodate this offensive scientific material, which really just cuts across all of those things. So let's not be surprised that climate change science is difficult to grasp, because just like in the case of Galileo and the case of the heliocentric universe, the reality of climate change is quite abstract. Yes, we do have weather events which are plugged into this shift in the climate, but fundamentally you can't see climate change other than in graphs. You can only observe it with scientific data, because climate change happens over huge periods of time. And so we have this gap between the reality of climate change as it appears to science and observational science, and the lived reality of people, which is much more material, much more sensory. So just before we exit this deep dive, it's interesting to remember some words of Schopenhauer. Well, these are attributed to Schopenhauer. He said that truth always passes through three phases. First, it's ridiculed. Secondly, it's violently opposed. And thirdly, it's just accepted as common sense. And we can see this through the history of science in Western culture. That what is happening now happened with Galileo back in 1633. And I think we can take comfort from this. Like, in the end, the Catholic Church did accept Galileo's conclusions. Okay, it took a while for that to happen, and it was only in the 90s that they published some stamps with Galileo's face on it as a kind of way of saying sorry. But in the end, it did come through. Truth came out, or as Shakespeare says, murder will out. Like, in the end, the truth is just the truth, and it has a kind of resilience to it. And I think if we just take Galileo as a little role model for that, that he bravely stood up and defended the truth. And he actually, we know from his letters that he invited some of his friends around to his house to look down his telescope into the night sky to make these observations of the moon and the stars. And many of his friends just couldn't bring themselves to do it. And Galileo was going bonkers with that. It's like, I can't believe that men of science are not willing to look down this telescope. I mean, they're not even prepared to look at it. So this mystery, or this puzzle of psychology, of power, and of science, all these kind of, the way in which these interact in a complex way, it's not new. And if we just look over our shoulder, and if we look forward, we can fix a nice kind of navigation point for ourselves, that in the end, you can break through the truth. The truth has got a clarity to it. And in the end, it just looks like common sense. And I think, well, I hope that this is how it will be for climate change. We will look back on these years and just laugh at how stupid we were to not look down the telescope, or how ridiculous it was that men of science and the truth was suppressed by power interests of just a few. So this is the game. It's not a new game, but let's enjoy it. So what about the gaps between the trees? Because there are some gaps. even if you get your head in exactly the right place to look at those trees, there are some little gaps. And when you take the big view, those gaps, of course, open up. So let's be honest, there are some gaps in our scientific knowledge. That's true. We have understood climate science since the mid-19th century with a great deal of clarity. And in the last decades, we have emphatically understood it. This will become clear in later episodes. But that's not to say that there aren't some margins of error, margins of doubt. For example, in terms of Earth system science, in terms of the physics of carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, we're still not exactly sure how CO2 relates to temperature. We have a very good idea, but it's not exactly true because it is a complex system. Likewise, when physicists project forward and they try to anticipate what the effects of 2 degrees is going to be or 3 degrees is going to be, because the Earth is such a massive complex system, there's things that you might miss. For example, it was only recently that the growth of algae in the northern hemisphere, in the Arctic, was recognized and included into the calculations. Now, in some ways, this is a small thing, yeah, like algae growing on ice makes it a bit darker, and that darkness makes the ice melt faster, which produces more algae, which makes it darker, and we have a feedback loop in play, which is accelerating the melting. Now, that is quite significant for that area, but it took a while for that data to be included in the calculations. So there are these like glitches, there are some uncertainties, there are things which we are not fully on top of, but that's okay. Part of being a mature scientist, part of being a mature human being is being able to cope with ambiguities and being able to handle that in a way that is sensible and clear. And in the background to this, you have the fossil fuel industry that has poured all of its energy into trying to undermine the science of climate change. So these small uncertainties have been amplified by the fossil fuel industry to appear as if they are great uncertainties, as if there's no consensus in the science and so on. And that's just wrong. It's just completely out of order. So climate science is emphatically clear. It has been for over 100 years, and all that we're doing is just fine-tuning these small details of Earth systems, our understanding of Earth systems. So the answer to if you can start an academy on your own is absolutely, emphatically yes. There are always people who take the lead, take the initiative, and you could be one of them. People like Galileo in the past, people like Copernicus, they broke new ground. They were willing, they were brave to investigate things which they understood would cause trouble. And the willingness to step outside of the status quo, the willingness to think about things from a wider perspective, the willingness to be committed to science, the willingness to engage in exploratory thinking, these are all marks of a great human being. So, yes, you can start an academy on your own. This book is freely available. I'm completely committed to the public understanding of science, just like Semantic Climate, an organization based in Cambridge. And you can be part of that community, just trying to make science better understood. And not in this nerdy academic way, but in a way which is understanding of the social context into which that scientific truth is landing. This is the wonderful puzzle of the Climate Academy. It's got two bits to it. It is about learning for yourself, taking this PDF, taking this book, getting yourself properly informed from a systems perspective, but then taking that knowledge into the world. So the Climate Academy has got two pillars. Pillar 1 is systems understanding, and pillar 2 is this civic engagement, which is what the next episode is all about. But I just want to point here that it is absolutely possible to start a thing on your own. Galileo was alone with his telescope and he invited his friends to look, and some of them would have looked. Some of them would have started something. So be brave, get going, get over that hump, get over the fragmented ad hoc bits of knowledge about climate and get yourself a proper systems view and then play with it.